the solution will get redder and redder until it eventually becomes nearly black. I had a stir bar at the bottom and eventually became liquefied enough that I was actually able to stir it. So we want to heat it at this temperature of around 200 degrees Celsius for at least 30 minutes. It's important not to heat it up too much because the product can decompose. Above I've included the overall reaction that's occurring between the phthalic anhydride and the resorcinol. So as you can see, one molecule of phthalic anhydride will react with 2 molecules of resorcinol. The mechanism behind this reaction is pretty complicated and there's 3 distinct steps that occur. Without going into too much detail, the phthalic anhydride undergoes a Friedel-Crafts reaction twice with each molecule of resorcinol. These 2 Friedel-Crafts reactions result in the production of 1 water molecule, but they also create an intermediate molecule that can undergo a Fischer esterification with itself. So it does just that, and in doing so, it forms the final fluorescein molecule and also expels 1 water molecule. In the scheme, I've color-coded everything so you can see where things end up. All of the hydrogens in the waters come from resorcinol, but in each water, 1 oxygen will come from the resorcinol and the other will come from the phthalic anhydride. The sulfuric acid that is used is a catalyst, and it will catalyze both the Friedel-Crafts reactions and the Fischer esterification. If you'd like to know more about the mechanism, reactions. Sulfuric acid will come from the resorcinol and the other will come from resorcinol, but in each water, 1 oxygen will come from the resorcinol and the other will come from the phthalic anhydride. The sulfuric oxygen will come from the resorcinol and the other will come from the phthalic anhydride. The sulfuric acid that is used is a catalyst, and it will catalyze both the Friedel-Crafts reactions and the Fischer esterification. If you would like to know more about the Friedel-Crafts reactions and the Fischer esterification. If you would like to know more about the mechanism, I've included a good link below in the description. After the 30 minutes is up, it's removed from the oil bath and allowed to cool to room temperature. At this point, you can do 2 things. If you don't want to isolate the fluorescein, you can simply dissolve this crude product in some sodium hydroxide solution. This would give you a nice stock solution that you can start playing with immediately. This is what is done in most of the videos I've seen online, but I actually wanted to... This would give you a nice stock solution that you can start playing with immediately. This is what is done in most of the videos I've seen online, but I actually wanted to isolate the fluorescein itself. And to do this, we're going to need to do a little bit of a workup. It's taken inside and a stir bar is added, and you can see the crude product is now solidified. I then added about 15 milliliters of acetone to dissolve the fluorescein. Fluorescein is very to dissolve the fluorescein. Fluorescein is very soluble in acetone, but we do have a hard block on the bottom, so it still takes a little while to fully dissolve. Slowly, as more fluorescein dissolves into the acetone, it should get darker and darker red. Eventually, when it doesn't seem like much more is dissolving, the acetone is decanted into a beaker. The process is then repeated by adding more acetone until everything in the flask has fully dissolved. In the end, I used a total of about 50 milliliters of acetone, but the exact quantity really doesn't matter. Even when there's very little fluorescein left in the flask, it might be dyed yellow, and it's kind of a waste of acetone to try to fully remove it. So here's the beaker, which looks like it has a bit over 50 milliliters of acetone. The heat is then turned up, and the acetone is removed. The use of the acetone is really nothing more than to just transfer it to a larger container. By doing this, the surface area is increased, and it makes for the next step where we dissolve it in ether go much faster. In theory, though, you can skip this step. It just might take a lot longer to dissolve in the ether. When the acetone's all gone, we're left with a syrupy mix on the bottom that slowly solidifies as it cools down. Once it's fully cooled down, we're left with a nice red glass on the bottom of the beaker. To the cool glassy mixture, I added about 20 milliliters of diethyl ether and a few milliliters of distilled water. The fluorescein is actually not soluble in water, but the addition of it greatly increases the rate that it's dissolved into the ether. Another stir bar is placed into the beaker because the old one is kind of stuck in the mixture. A watch glass is then also placed on top because ether evaporates pretty quickly. At some points when it didn't seem like a lot of the fluorescein was dissolving, adding more water seemed to be more beneficial than adding more ether. And to speed things up a little more, I added a further 20 milliliters of diethyl ether followed by a little bit of water again. After about 10 minutes, a lot of it was dissolved except for some goo on the bottom. The diethyl ether and the water was then transferred to a separatory funnel. And the dissolving step was repeated by adding another 40 milliliters of diethyl ether to the beaker, followed by again several mils of water. You'll notice that this time, the ether seems to be a lot less concentrated with fluorescein than before. And if you look at the bottom, there's still a lot of that black stuff. Anyway, the diethyl ether and the water was again transferred to a separatory funnel. More diethyl ether is added, but you'll notice that there's still quite a bit of that black stuff at the bottom. I found this stuff was stubborn and it really wouldn't go into the ether layer unless I added a bunch of water. Keep adding water until it fully dissolves into the ether layer. In this step, I added a lot more water than I did in the previous one, and you can see the ether has taken up a lot more fluorescein. And after just a few minutes of stirring, it seemed like everything was taken up into the ether. So again, just like before, it was added to the everything. 40 milliliters of diethyl ether to the beaker, followed by again several mils of water. You'll notice that this time, the ether seems to be a lot less concentrated with fluorescein than before. And if you look at the bottom, there's still a lot of that black stuff. Anyway, the diethyl ether and the water was again transferred to a separatory funnel. More diethyl ether is added, but you'll notice that there's still quite a bit of that black stuff at the bottom. I found this stuff was stubborn and it really wouldn't go into the ether layer unless I added a bunch of water. Keep adding water until it fully dissolves into the ether layer. In this step, I added a lot more water than I did in the previous one, and you can see the ether has taken up a lot more fluorescein. And after just a few minutes of stirring, it seemed like everything was taken up into the ether. So again, just like before, it was added to the other extractions in the separatory funnel. And then, with a small amount of ether and water, a final washing was done of the beaker. And then for the final time, this was added to the separatory funnel as well. Once all the extracts were together, I mixed them around thoroughly. Before proceeding on, I drained away the lower water layer that was left over from the extraction steps. And now to our fully loaded separatory funnel with our product, I added 50 milliliters of water. This washing step serves mostly to wash out sulfuric acid and leftover resorcinol. So as we always do with the separatory funnel, we cap, shake, and vent, and then we put it back on the stand for the layers to separate. Once the layers have separated, we can discard our lower water layer. The washing step is repeated, but this time I used 50 milliliters of saturated salt solution. You'll notice that before adding it, the top ether layer is a little cloudy. However, after the capping, shaking, and venting, you can see it's cleared up a lot. So now the bottom layer, which is mostly water, is drained away into a beaker. The upper ether layer is poured into an Erlenmeyer flask, and it's dried using molecular sieves. This is just to pull out any of the water that might remain. I also could have used another compatible drying agent like sodium sulfate, but I just like molecular sieves. After letting it dry for several minutes, it's directly gravity filtered into a round bottom flask. I then set up a little simple distillation to remove and recover my ether. Near the end of the distillation, it looks kind of like red paint. It was actually really hard to dry, and at this point it didn't really seem like any more ether was coming off. To solidify it, I actually had to pull a small vacuum on it while heating. Eventually we were left with this very dark red crust. However, it was still a little bit damp despite the vacuum and the heating, So I took it out and put it in an oven. Be careful if you do this though, because there will still be some phthalic anhydride left over, which might sublimate. After the oven, I was left with about 3 grams of nice dry fluorescein. To test it out, I then prepared a sodium hydroxide solution. Once it had fully dissolved, I added a little bit of fluorescein to it. You might notice the sodium hydroxide solution is a little bit green before I add it. This is because the spatula I used to put in the sodium hydroxide was contaminated with a little bit of fluorescein. Anyway, I then turn on the stirring to fully dissolve the fluorescein, and you can see the solution quickly turns to a dark red. However, you might notice at the top it's actually a little bit green.
Перейдя на удаленку, мы пытались сделать все как в офисе. Оказалось, это не так просто. В Райк мы обновляем график, и он корректируется автоматически. Когда мы работаем дома, нас тормозят не только медлительные партнеры.
Во вторник Брэд должен быть на объекте. Может, Сара могла бы его подменить? Дети, успокойтесь!
В Райк сразу видно, что у Сэма в пятницу отгул, так что Сара сможет подменить и его. Иногда цена вопроса больше, чем цена доски.
А ты уверен, что клиент утвердил для брошюры файл 254 финальный вариант?
Да вроде да. Ой, а может это был 254 финальный вариант финального варианта?
И сколько мы распечатали?
20 тысяч. Райк Пруф сохраняет всю историю ваших материалов и утвержденных файлов, так что вы точно знаете, что нужно распечатать. Как видите, удаленка – это просто. Попробуйте бесплатную версию Райк.
From the stock solution of fluorescein, it can then dropwise be added to a beaker of water. And I do this under UV light for added effect.
Да.
At this
Понимаешь, короче. Ладно. Да. Да, понимает, он тебя просто... Да, понимает. Да. Он надо себе думать просто. Ну, есть такая ситуация. Да, все не получается просто. Да, А. безработничай. Нет. работает он хорошо. Да, да.